If you think about it, video games are the very first natively digital art form. All other major art forms that we discuss, film, music, literature, visual arts, all of them began life in an analog form. It's just been that over the past few years, we've slowly shifted the container for these art forms into a digital format, but they have a long history of being analog art forms. Video games, however, this is not the case. Video games need a digital basis. They need code. If you do not have code, you do not have a video game. And in fact, if you think about it, the term video game is kind of misleading in terms of what defines a video game, because you can absolutely have what we would call a video game without video at all. You don't need video. You could just open up Game Maker right now, and with audio cues, you could create what we would consider a video game. What makes a video game is the code, the digital automated set of rules. That is what makes something a video game. In reverse as well, you could try to simulate what we consider a video game, like you could be a sort of dungeon master and set down a group of players, play visual prompts, even have like real-time button presses that you interpret and you assign value to. And you could probably come pretty close to giving a video game-like experience through analog form, but still, the defining feature of video games is their digital code, their automated set of rules that are determined by a computer, not by a human being. That is what makes something a video game. And I bring all this up because there's been a lot of talk lately about the digital future of video games and how physical sales of video games are quickly disappearing and declining. And while I can really understand and empathize with the aspects of physical video games, as people call them, even though that's not what they are, I do think it is worthwhile to discuss and understand the nature of video games a little bit better, because sometimes these conversations stop making some sense if you really think about it. And so I thought this could be a kind of interesting topic to talk about, because as much as I like what we would call physical video games and how I can connect with certain aspects of physical video games, and I think actually there are things about physical video games that you're connecting with that have nothing to do with the game itself, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, I can't help but feel that this insistence that video games have a physical history is just incorrect. And there's actually a lot of real life examples of this that I want to get into. Not saying, of course, that you can't collect and enjoy physical video games, but more like to understand that when you compare it to other art forms, especially manga and books, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, them continuing to have analog formats makes a lot more sense than video games, because in the past, historically, when you think of physical video games, analog video games, what are you thinking of? You're probably thinking of Super Nintendos and cartridges and even arcade boards. But all of those things are just little computers or little computer parts.
We call them games. Sega Saturn has tons of them. Pretendo has just a few. It does beg the question, do you want to play or twiddle your thumbs? Face it, Pretendo, you weren't worth waiting for.
So let's start by talking about what I would consider the truest form of analog media, printed books like The Sun Also Rises here, or even printed manga like Berserk. I won't open Berserk because I might get copyright struck, but printed media like this are the truest form of analog media, in my opinion, because there are no barriers between you as a physical human being and the art to be consumed. And in fact, even if you're typing in the comments, oh no, to access a physical book you need light, that's not necessarily true, because Braille exists. So as long as you can feel, you can basically consume the printed written word either with your eyes or physically through Braille. With manga, you can't have Braille, so they're a little bit less true analog. You have to have light to consume physical manga, but the natural world, daylight, unless you're in Alaska, there's not going to be a lot of barriers, no matter where you are, no matter what time period you're in, to accessing printed media like this. However, when it comes to physical objects that house digital media, this is where things get fun, and this is where I can't help but push back on this whole notion of preserving video games through physical discs or physical cartridges, because that's not true because of a lot of certain factors. So let's get to the first factor, which is there is an intermediary between you and the files, you and the digital media, whether it's a video game or whether it's music in a digital form or film in a digital form, because there is this layer that the developers, the publishers, the companies can put in to stop you from accessing the media, or just the physical need for electricity and computers can stop you. If you're out in the woods for too long and you have no power and you have no, I guess, solar way to power your shit, it's done for. In today's modern society, the more pressing issue that people tend to talk about is the more like copyright, DRM concern. And a really funny example of this is this bad boy right here. So this is a bootleg print of Dune I did off of my Works printer a few years ago, just for the hell of it, just because I thought it'd be kind of fun. So I got the digital form of Dune and printed it out into a physical book. And there's no way to prevent me from doing this. There's no barrier to this to be possible. If you are the copyright holder of Dune, you can't stop me from reading this book, from physically accessing the book. If you have the physical book in your hand, it's game over. You can't stop them. But in terms of digital media, that is not the case. Even going all the way back to cartridges, Nintendo, even back then, had some DRM measures to prevent bootleg cartridges from running on their system. So there is that digital intermediary. And I know what a lot of you are saying, oh, well, wait, no, but if you modify it, if you change the system digitally, then they will work. Yes, but you are having to combat fire with fire. In order to get around DRM, you have to activate your own sort of digital anti-DRM tactics. That's my point. The idea that you can truly preserve a natively digital art form like video games through only analog means is fundamentally incorrect. Down to just the nature of the art form itself, it will not work. Because, like I said, the iPod is just a physical container for digital media. And at one point or another, that cartridge, that PS4 disc, your PS4 system itself will physically break down. And when that happens, you're showing up to a gunfight empty-handed. You don't even have a knife. You're showing up empty-handed. And so let's say in the future, PSN goes down and I lose access to all of my digital games, and you've got your library of all your physical versions of the games you bought. You know, this is kind of the scenario a lot of people who buy like physical versions of games, when they're talking about buying them for the reason of preservation, sort of justifies like, okay, this is the future where all you suckers who bought those digital games are going to be out, and I'm going to have my physical discs and I'll be able to play the games. Which sounds cool and romantic, but realistically, how long is your built-to-fail console in tiny thin piece of plastic going to last? You're putting all your hopes and future and plan into just this thin, fragile piece of plastic that a 4-year-old can destroy in 2 seconds. I know, my kids have destroyed many discs faster than you can blink. Also, my brother in college lost all of his physical games because his apartment caught on fire, his building apartment caught on fire and burned everything. So he lost all of his physical games that way. So now, what do? What happens when that physical object is gone? You've got nothing left. Whereas the more realistic and more fitting example of game preservation is embracing its fundamental nature. And so you back up all your shit back onto a hard drive, you put all that data on multiple hard drives onto servers, spread it around digitally, multiple discs, bootleg discs, and then you use digital means to get around the DRM. And this is what we see pretty much historically every single time. I think you can almost document this as this is exactly how the process goes. From the Nintendo to the Sega Genesis to the Nintendo 64 to the Sega Saturn to the Sega Dreamcast to the PlayStation 2 to the Xbox, now to the Xbox 360 to the PS3. Every single time, this is what has happened. The data is transferred, backed up, preserved digitally, and then you use digital means to get around the DRM. That's going to happen with your PC games as well. A lot of PC games they don't have a disc version of them to even begin with. And a lot of games now are released digitally only. And so now let's dig into the tangible differences between interacting with a physical book versus interacting with a physical game. Begin with when you are reading a book, when you are reading a analog piece of media, there is a tangible physical difference between reading a book printed in 1950 versus reading it on a reader. Now, how you feel about this difference doesn't really matter. That's up to you. Sometimes I like reading things on reader because with EPUBs, you can zoom the font to be like giant. And so my pages on my e-reader contain literally like 20 words because I have the font be giant. I just flip through the pages super fast. Or sometimes I want to physically hold the book, go through, read it. But there is a difference in that experience. There is a tangible, literal difference in that experience versus playing a physical game or playing a digital game. As in the exact same game, by the way, as in different console ports and variations, because that doesn't count. That's more like the equivalent of a literary translation. I'm talking the exact same game. So DOJ is coming out on PS4. Let's talk about the differences between playing the digital version of DOJ on the PS4 versus playing the physical disc version of DOJ on the PS4. Hint, there is no difference. There's no difference, especially on modern consoles, because modern consoles literally just take the disc data and install it onto the hard drive. So there's no difference. When you play the physical or digital version of DOJ on the PS4, nothing. It is the same, one-to-one, zero difference. And so when people talk about the differences between physical and digital consumption of games, they talk about the periphery, the things that you do outside the game, like getting up and getting some coffee and putting your disc in and hearing the whir of the hard drive and reading the instruction manual. All that I think is cool. All that I think is totally fine. And if you want to do that and pay for that experience, that's fine. But that's nothing to do with the actual game. You could take a blank disc, have the hard drive version of the game on there, just stick a disc in there, any disc, and then just pick the hard drive version of the game and play it. There won't be any real tangible difference as in like reading a physically different printed book. So I think this is important to discuss because when people talk about buying physical versions of games, what is the value of these that you don't get in the digital version? What is the real selling point of the physical versions of games? Because I reject this whole notion that in the future you need to buy the disc itself because, oh no, in the future PSN's gonna go down and the only way you're gonna be able to access the game is with this little disc. That's the only possible option. When realistically, like I said, games are going to be preserved digitally, either through emulation or through hacking or through digital backup pirate copies. That is how games are going to get preserved into the future. And so what is the real value of these physical versions, in my opinion? Well, it's the extra stuff that comes with it, the physical stuff, like the instruction booklets, like the cool extra art books, like the little swag they add in. And I know that sounds trite, but what is an instruction booklet? A book, a true piece of analog media. So ironically, the irony is the most analog thing that video games have are instruction booklets. And so kind of an interesting thought is if you're into like PS2 games or PS3 games or PS4 games, you almost could justify collecting instruction booklets as being more legitimate in terms of analog media versus collecting the game discs because an emulator, or if you want to be super accurate, a hacked version of the console like my PS2 with the hard drive mod, Why do I even need to get discs from my PS2 now? I get them, I'm like, what am I gonna do with this? It's already on the hard drive, and if worse comes to worse, I could rip the game and put it on the hard drive. Whereas the instruction manuals and art books, sure, you can download them on a PDF and you can read them on a Kindle, and that's cool and everything, but you can't actually replace the physical feeling of opening those instruction manuals and reading them physically, tangibly, the glossy paper and everything. And so in my opinion, ironically enough, when I look at physical versions of games being sold now, what I want to see is you better have an instruction manual and some kind of like extra swag in there. Otherwise, what is the point? But there is no point other than the game cases look cool and you can put them in the background of your YouTube videos or something. And some of you may be saying, well, I like to buy the physical versions because I want to either resell that same copy later in the future, or I want to trade it or give it away, and you can't really do that with digital games in the current infrastructure. And I will say that right now, that is one of the coolest things about physical games and why sometimes I buy physical games. Like I bought Final Fantasy 16 physically because I want to resell that disc because I don't really want to play it into the future. But that is something that is going to work now, but it's not going to work too far into the future. So that's a selling point now, but you're either going to run up into the problem of a lot of games now are just not available physically. So then you either got to sit around forever to get the physical version to be released by some small boutique company. Maybe that boutique company gets that physical version to you at some point. Maybe they don't. Maybe they just take your money and see you later. So there's that whole problem. But also this feature of the physical container is going to get curtailed one way or another. Either it's going to be rendered obsolete by other more powerful physical containers like hard drives and flash carts. This is what has killed my interest in cartridge-based games now because, yeah, I love Sin and Punishment and I'd love to have Sin and Punishment in the cartridge, but because of the economy of paying so much more for that physical container, why don't I just buy a superior physical container in a flash cart and have Sin and Punishment and like all the cool N64 games and have them run identically on the console if that's what I want to do. So it's either going to get replaced by a newer, more powerful physical container. That's why iPods are discontinued, right? Because now, your phone is an iPod and it's also a phone. I like iPods, but that whole container has been rendered obsolete by more powerful, versatile, cheap, better physical containers. Same thing with cartridges. Flash carts have replaced them. Hard drives have replaced disc-based stuff. Again, versus a truly analog object like a physical book, where here is not a first edition, but like a third edition of Capote's In Cold Blood. And here's a modern edition of Capote's In Cold Blood. They are basically the same. Yes, maybe the texture of the pages in the modern version is a little bit more supple, but with a physical medium like a book, you can only put so many printed words on a physical page, and there's a natural resolution issue where if you make the words smaller, they get harder to read. If you make the words bigger, now you need more pages. And it doesn't matter if you're in the year 2023 or if you're in the year 1950 or 60 or whenever the published date of the original version was, that same issue will always exist. So you get a medium where the art is literally integrated with the physical object. The art and the physical object are one in the same, versus a container where this iPod could have 1,000 gigs worth of music on it or 1 gig of music on it. You actually do not know by looking at it. Whereas when you look at this volume of Berserk, it's got a lot of manga in there because the manga is physically tied to the pages. So I find this topic really interesting, and I think it is a new way to understand why certain types of physical media, like printed books and vinyl records, are still holding strong, while other types of physical media, like CDs, DVDs, Blu Rays, video game discs, are starting to go away, because a CD, DVD, Blu Ray, video game disc is just a container for the digital information. Even a cartridge is just a container for the digital information, whereas a printed book, the art is integrated physically into the object. Same thing with a vinyl record. That is why you can only have so many songs at a certain amount of quality on a vinyl record, because the music is physically etched into the surface of the plastic, whereas what's burned onto a CD, even though CDs are cool, are just ones and zeros, and how many ones and zeros can you contain on that medium, and how quickly can you interpret those ones and zeros. It's not tied to the container in the same way. So long story short, if you're an aesthetic person and you miss the days of physical game manuals and physically holding the cartridges, I say just go ahead and start buying physical game manuals just separately. It'll be a lot cheaper and probably you'll get a lot more out of it than you expect. And if you want media that is more analog and integrated and you want access to media of that type, start buying some physical manga, start buying some physical books. I think you'll enjoy it a lot more than you expect. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Autoname, Beam Pit, Bo, Ben, Beto Dames, Bog Hog, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksand666, Cook Some Soup, Krusty Boy, Des Audio, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, Disco Stas Leia, DJ420 Praise It, Dr. Bosky, Elias Alonso, Evan Serafet, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Hausu, Jake Ryan, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, George Sand, K, K2, K-Horse, Contain, Praise the Boys, Low Casting, Myashpa, Malaise, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Moonro, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Pedro Perez, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Rafael Trujillo, Raul, Real Skeen, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, Cisa FW, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Super Funk, SW1335, Tamzarian, Takero Mucho, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Toho Rizardi, Tsugumo, 2YU, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.